The HOA sent cops to my house. They thought they had me cornered, but they didn't know about one thing. I opened the door, expecting a lecture, maybe a fine. But what happened next? They saw her, standing in uniform, and suddenly, the power shifted. They froze. Their faces drained of color. What were they about to do? What could they say? You won't believe what happened next. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. My name's Mark, and I'm here to share stories from the front lines of suburban drama. I live right here in City neighborhood, where the HOA's power trip is a daily battle. And trust me, I've seen it all. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story, because you're not going to want to miss what happened next. I never thought much of the HOA. In fact, I didn't even know what it stood for when I first moved into this neighborhood. To me, they were just a bunch of neighbors who seemed to think they had some say over everyone's life. And I wasn't the only one who thought this way. Most people just kept their heads down and did what they were told. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. You know that kind of quiet where nothing really happens, and you start to wonder if something's hiding beneath the surface? That's how it felt. The lawns were perfectly manicured. The mailboxes were all the same height. Every house looked almost identical, like they were all part of some weird suburban dream. I had been living here for a few months, trying to adjust to the small-town life, away from the noise and chaos of the city. It was supposed to be peaceful, but peaceful sometimes means boring. The most exciting thing that happened was Mrs. Jenkins' dog running away, and even that felt like it belonged in some small-town soap opera. But then it started. Small at first. A note on the door, a red sticker on my trash can. Little things that didn't seem important at the time. I thought, what's the big deal? I ignored the first note. It was about my lawn being a little too long. Okay, fine, I thought. I'll cut it tomorrow. But then another note came, and another, each one nitpicking something else. The mailbox was too tall. The fence was the wrong color. It felt like they were just waiting for me to slip up, just waiting for a reason to give me a hard time. I shrugged it off at first. I wasn't one to argue. If they wanted to complain about my lawn, fine, I'd fix it. But then, one day, the letter came. The official one, the one that meant business. It was addressed in bold, official-looking letters, and it said I was in violation of several HOA rules. I was given a deadline to fix everything, or they would be forced to take further action. I stood there staring at the letter, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't just a casual complaint. No, this felt different. It felt personal. I'd heard the rumors about the HOA president, how she was a stickler for rules, how she had a vendetta against anyone who didn't conform to her perfect little vision of the neighborhood. I didn't know much about her, but I'd seen her around. She walked with an air of superiority, her head held high, like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. The way she spoke to people was condescending, like she knew better than everyone else. She seemed harmless at first, just another suburban character. But now, after receiving that letter, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for me to slip up, so she could pounce. I had to fix this. I needed to make sure I was in line with everything the HOA wanted. But I wasn't about to let her think she could push me around. So I decided I'd follow every rule to the letter, just to see what would happen. If I did every thing right, could she still find a way to make my life miserable? But that wasn't the only thing on my mind. There was something else, something that made me uneasy. The officers. I had heard rumors about the HOA using the cops to enforce their rules. The stories were almost unbelievable. that they had enough influence to send officers to people's homes to make sure they followed the rules. But was that even legal? Could they really send cops to my house over a lawn that was an inch too tall? I didn't know the answer, but I wasn't going to find out the hard way. I had to stay ahead of them. I had to make sure I wasn't caught off guard. The days went by, and I made sure everything was perfect. The lawn was trimmed, the fence was freshly painted. I even lowered the mailbox a few inches. I followed every rule, every regulation they had, but I still couldn't shake that feeling. It was like a storm was brewing. I could feel it in the air, the tension, the subtle pressure from the HOA. And then, just when I thought I had done everything right, the knock on the door came. The sound was sharp and demanding, like the universe was about to turn upside down. I wasn't prepared for what came next. I opened the door, and standing there were 2 police officers. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions serious. The HOA had sent cops, not just a letter, not just a fine, but cops. What was going on here? Was this really happening? Was I really about to get arrested over a mailbox that was a little too tall? I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening. But my brain couldn't process it. Why would the HOA send cops to my door? It wasn't like I was committing a crime. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was just trying to live my life in peace. But no, the HOA had other plans for me. And now, with the cops standing on my doorstep, I knew something big was coming. I just didn't know what. Could I really stand up to this? Was there a way out of this mess? Or was I about to find out the hard way how far the HOA would go to get what they wanted? I stood there frozen, staring at the 2 police officers standing on my doorstep. Their presence felt surreal, like something straight out of a bad TV show. But this wasn't scripted. This was real. They were here, on my property, ready to do something. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My palms were sweaty, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. One officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had fallen between us. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, his voice sharp and formal. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am." The other officer stepped forward, holding a thick envelope in his hand. It looked official, like one of those envelopes you get from the court, the kind that always carries bad news. I felt a lump form in my throat as I glanced at it. The HOA's letterhead was clearly visible. "Is this your residence?" the first officer continued, his eyes scanning the house behind me. I was suddenly acutely aware of every little detail. The overgrown plant in the corner of the yard, the small cracks on the driveway that no one had bothered to fix. I didn't realize how much I had taken my home for granted until now, when 2 strangers were standing in my doorway, judging everything. "Yeah," I said, my voice a little more shaky than I wanted it to be. "What's going on?" The second officer slid the envelope into my hands, his gaze never leaving my face. "The HOA has filed several complaints against you," he said, as though reading from a script. "It's serious. If these violations aren't corrected, they could take further action." I felt the blood drain from my face. The HOA had filed complaints, and now the police were involved? I couldn't believe it. What kind of authority did these people have? What kind of power were they wielding? "What violations?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm even though my mind was racing. What had I done wrong? What could be so bad that it warranted this kind of attention? The first officer flipped open the envelope and handed me a stack of papers. I looked down at the list, and my heart sank. Lawn height violations, mailbox height violation. The paint on the fence was the wrong shade of beige. And worst of all, the plants I had in my garden were apparently non-compliant. Non-compliant with what? I couldn't wrap my head around it. These were the kind of things I'd seen other neighbors get nitpicked for, but I never thought it would be my turn. And now, here I was, holding a list of violations with 2 officers standing on my doorstep like I was some kind of criminal. "Look," I said, trying to steady myself. "I had no idea about these so-called violations. I didn't mean to break any rules." The officers exchanged a glance. It wasn't the kind of look that said, "We understand." No, this was the kind of look that said, "You're on thin ice." The first officer cleared his throat again. "You need to fix these violations within the next 7 days, or we'll have no choice but to escalate this," he said. His tone was cold, formal, distant. He wasn't here to help me fix anything. He was here to enforce something. Before I could respond, the door behind me opened, and my wife stepped into view. The officers didn't react immediately. They just stared, and then their eyes widened, their jaws tightened, but they didn't say a word. I could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change that told me they weren't in control anymore. She wasn't just any O. In walking out of that door. My wife wasn't just some regular suburban mom. She was a police officer herself, a detective. And now she was standing there, wearing her uniform, her badge glinting in the sunlight. The officers stiffened, their eyes flicking between me and her. I could see the surprise in their faces. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite place. "Is there a problem?" my wife asked, her voice calm and professional. She didn't seem rattled at all. In fact, she looked completely unbothered by the situation. She had probably seen things a lot worse than this in her line of work, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by a couple of officers who looked like they had just come from a department meeting about HOA rules. One of the officers cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Ma'am, we're just here to enforce some complaints made by the HOA," he said. But his words were hesitant, almost unsure. He wasn't used to seeing someone like her walk out of the house. She wasn't just any homeowner. She was someone who had the power to make them rethink their actions. "Complaints?" she repeated, her tone cool. "What complaints?" The officer handed her the papers without another word. My wife took the papers from his hands and glanced at them. Her eyes narrowed as she read the list of violations. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't just reading the complaints. She was analyzing them. She was taking everything in, figuring out what to do next. When she looked back up, the officers were both standing a little straighter, waiting for her next move. But instead of yelling or getting defensive, she just smiled. It was one of those smiles that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made people nervous. "I think you've got the wrong address," she said simply. "These so-called violations are either exaggerated or outright false." The officers exchanged glances. They were starting to understand. My wife wasn't some scared homeowner they could push around. She wasn't going to back down just because they were carrying badges, and she certainly wasn't afraid of the HOA. "You might want to double-check your facts," she added, her voice cool and calm, but her words were firm. The officers looked at each other, unsure of what to say next. They had been sent here to enforce the HOA's rules, but now they were standing in front of someone who wasn't afraid of them. Or the HOA. The silence stretched out. They didn't know what to do. They had expected a fight, but not like this. And that's when I realized something. The HOA wasn't just a group of neighbors following rules. They were a force. And I had just poked the bear. The officer stood there for a moment, caught in the web of uncertainty my wife had woven. Their professional demeanor cracked slightly. but they quickly recovered, trying to regain control of the situation. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her. The first officer shifted on his feet, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're just following orders from the HOA," he said, but it sounded more like an apology than an excuse. "The complaints are serious, and if they aren't addressed, well, you understand how this works." My wife's gaze never wavered. She remained calm, cool, and collected, like a lioness sizing up her prey. The tension in the air thickened, but she wasn't fazed. "I understand," she said slowly, her voice deliberate. "But what I understand is that this HOA is using its power to intimidate people for trivial reasons, and that stops today." There was a moment of silence, one where I could almost feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. The officers looked at each other again, as if silently debating whether or not to back down. They weren't used to this. People usually folded under pressure. They complied when faced with authority. But we weren't complying. Not today. I stood there feeling the tension grow, my mind spinning. I had no idea what my wife had planned, but whatever it was, I knew it was going to change everything. I could feel the storm brewing within her, the quiet resolve she always carried when she was about to strike. One of the officers stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "We don't want to escalate things," he said, his voice less confident now. "But you're going to have to deal with the HOA's demands, one way or another." I could feel the weight of his words like an invisible pressure pressing down on my chest. But my wife wasn't backing down. In fact, I could see the fire in her eyes now, the same fire she'd had when she fought for justice in the police force. This wasn't just about a few rules anymore. This was about standing up to something much bigger, something that had been holding power over people for far too long. She folded her arms, her posture no longer just defensive but assertive. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," she said, her voice growing more firm. "We will deal with this on our terms. You can go back to the HOA. Tell them we're more than willing to follow the rules, but we're not going to be bullied into submission." I watched as the officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. My wife wasn't the kind of person they could easily intimidate. I knew they expected to walk in here, throw their weight around, and walk out with me cowering. But instead, they found themselves facing a wall they hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," the second officer said, his voice softer now, "we understand your position, but the HOA has the final say. We're only here to enforce their regulations." The words hung in the air, almost laughable now. The HOA has the final say, I thought. It was like a twisted joke. The HOA? The group of powers, the hungry neighbors who thought they could control everything from the height of your mailbox to the color of your fence? It was absurd, and now it seemed like the officers were starting to realize just how absurd it all was. My wife stepped closer to them, her eyes unwavering. "Let me tell you something about authority," she said, her voice lowering, but still with that bite of power behind it. "True authority doesn't rely on intimidation. It's not about making people fear you. It's about earning respect. And I don't respect a group of people who think they can impose rules without any consideration for the people they're affecting." The officers were silent now, as if they had been caught off guard by her words. She wasn't angry. She wasn't yelling. She was simply speaking truth, and it was cutting through them like a knife. "We'll fix the issues you've listed," she continued, "but we will not do it on the HOA's terms. We'll do it on ours. If the HOA wants to get involved, fine. But they better be prepared to answer to more than just a couple of fines. They're going to have to answer to something bigger." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't just standing up for us. She was calling out the very system that had made our lives miserable for so long. The officers stood still, their faces hard to read. I could see them processing what she was saying, but I could also tell they were starting to doubt the power the HOA had over them. They weren't in control anymore. My wife had taken that power from them without ever raising her voice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first officer nodded stiffly. We'll report back to the HOA, he said, his tone less certain than before. But just know, this isn't over. You'll have to deal with them eventually. He turned to leave, but before he stepped off the porch, my wife spoke again. Tell them to check their facts first, she said, her voice sharp. Because if they come back here without the right information, they'll regret it. The officers left without another word, and the door clicked shut behind them. I stood there, still processing everything that had just happened. It wasn't just a victory for us. It was a blow to the HOA's entire authority. We hadn't just accepted their rules. We had questioned them, called them out, and demanded they prove their worth. As the officers drove away, I couldn't help but think, this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And now, things were going to get interesting. The silence that followed the officers' departure was almost deafening. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. I stood in the living room, still staring at the door, my mind racing. It was like the world had shifted, like we had just made a stand against something bigger than just a few lawn violations. My wife closed the door behind the officers and turned to me, her face still calm, but there was a certain gleam in her eyes. She knew what this meant. It wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about power, and who held it. We just made them back down, I said, half in disbelief. It wasn't a question, more of a statement to myself. I was still processing everything. She nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. We did, she said. But we're not done yet. The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what she had planned, but I could tell it was big. I could feel it in the air. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Do you really think they'll just leave us alone? I asked, the concern creeping into my voice. I mean, they sent the cops after us. This isn't over. Her eyes flicked toward the window where the officers had driven off. No, it's not over, but now we've got their attention. No, they know we won't back down. That's what matters. I wasn't sure if I agreed. I didn't want to think about what could happen next, but I couldn't help it. The HOA was powerful. They had resources, influence. And it wasn't just about petty complaints anymore. It felt like we had just poked a sleeping giant. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting some sort of retaliation, some letter from the HOA, some warning. But nothing came. No fines, no legal threats. It was as if they were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I could feel the tension building. My wife went about her day like nothing had changed, but I could tell she was thinking about it. There was something in the way she looked at the mailbox, at the fence, at every little thing the HOA could nitpick. She wasn't just making sure things were in compliance, she was watching, waiting. And then one morning the knock came. It was so sudden, so unexpected that it made my heart jump into my throat. I wasn't ready for it, but I knew. I just knew. This was it. I opened the door, and there, standing in front of me, was the HOA president herself, Linda. She was standing tall, looking every bit the part of the suburban queen who thought she ruled everything. Behind her stood two other members of the HOA board, their faces stone cold. They weren't here to talk. Mr. Insert Name, Linda said, her voice sweet but laced with something colder. We need to have a little chat. I didn't know what to say. I had expected more letters, maybe more threats, but not this, not her standing on my doorstep like she owned the place. About what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought we were all clear after the officers came by. Linda's smile was all teeth. Oh, you were, she said, taking a step forward. But we've had a change of heart. We want to make sure you really understand the severity of these violations. I see. Stepped back, not letting her into the house, but feeling the weight of her presence. I understand the violations, I said slowly, but I still don't get why it's such a big deal. These aren't crimes. They're nothing. Just minor things that don't even affect anyone. She glanced at the board members behind her, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about control. And that was something she wasn't about to let go of. You don't get it, do you? She said, her voice dropping a little lower, a little more dangerous. This isn't about the lawn or the mailbox. This is about power. We control this neighborhood. We decide who follows the rules and who doesn't. And you? You've made a mistake by thinking you could challenge us. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about some lawn violation. This was about authority. The HOA wasn't just an organization of neighbors. It was a machine, and it ran on fear, on control. And they weren't about to let anyone challenge that. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this was just a misunderstanding. But something in her eyes told me that wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to be that simple. They weren't going to back down. Linda's gaze shifted to the two board members behind her. One of them stepped forward, holding a thick folder in his hand. We've taken further action, he said, his voice flat. We've filed a formal complaint with the city. We're pushing for legal action. I felt my stomach drop. Legal action? What were they talking about? What do you mean? I asked, my voice suddenly shaky. You're going to sue me over a mailbox? Linda smiled again, that same chilling smile. Not just the mailbox, Mr. Insert Name. Everything. You'll be hearing from our lawyer soon enough. She turned to leave, and the board members followed, her leaving me standing there, dumbfounded. They were serious. This wasn't just about some petty rules anymore. They were coming for us, and I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. As I stood there, watching them leave, I couldn't help but think, had we just unleashed a storm we weren't ready for? Were we really prepared to take on something this powerful? I barely slept that night. The weight of Linda's words kept playing over and over in my head, like a song I couldn't escape. We control this neighborhood. We decide who follows the rules and who doesn't. Her chilling smile haunted me. She didn't just want compliance. She wanted power, and she was willing to go to any lengths to get it. As the morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, I sat there, staring at the walls, trying to process everything. The HOA wasn't just a minor annoyance anymore. They were a force to be reckoned with. And now, they were pushing back hard. Filing legal action? It was too far, too extreme. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. My wife came into the room, looking as calm and composed as always, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't fooling me. She was concerned, too. We need a plan, she said, her voice steady but laced with determination. I nodded, but inside I was a storm of emotions. A plan? For what? To fight them in court? We don't even know what they've filed against us. She took a deep breath, sitting next to me. We're not going to let them walk all over us. We'll fight. We have to. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But what if we were out of our depth? What if the HOA had the power to destroy everything we had worked for? The fines, the legal battles, the humiliation. They were already playing dirty, and I wasn't sure how far they'd go. That's when the knock came. I froze. My wife stood up, her expression unreadable, but I could tell she was acing for something big. We had both been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I felt a pit form in my stomach. I opened the door, and standing there was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and holding a folder that looked ominous. "Mr. Insert Name?" he asked, his voice smooth and professional. "Yes," I replied, trying to mask the unease in my tone. "I'm with the HOA's legal team," he said, handing me the folder. "This is the official notice of legal action. You'll be hearing from our attorneys soon." I opened the folder, my hands trembling slightly as I looked over the documents. This wasn't a joke anymore. It was real. They were suing us. I glanced up at the man standing in front of me. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't believe this was happening. "We've outlined the specific violations," he said, his tone still smooth, as if this was all just business as usual. "This includes the unapproved landscaping, the mailbox height, and several other code violations. We believe you are in breach of the neighborhood's covenant, and we intend to take legal action unless this is resolved immediately." Legal action. The words echoed in my mind. I wanted to shout, to yell at him, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't prepared for a lawsuit. "Do you really think this is necessary?" I finally asked. "This is just a bunch of petty rules. You're suing me over my mailbox being an inch too tall?" He didn't flinch. "It's not just about the mailbox, Mr. Insert Name. It's about the rules. If we allow one person to break the rules, it sends a message that the HOA doesn't matter. That's why we have to follow through with this." I stood there in stunned silence, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. They weren't just after a few violations. They were using this as a way to make an example of me, to show the entire neighborhood that the HOA had control, that no one was above their rules. I wanted to refuse, to tell them they couldn't do this to us, but I knew better. They had already set the wheels in motion. There was no turning back now. As the man turned to leave, my wife stepped forward, her eyes locked on him. "You tell Linda," she said, her voice low and steady. "We're not backing down. We'll see them in court." The man paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe respect, maybe fear. But he didn't say anything. He simply nodded, then turned and walked away. When the door shut, the room felt suffocating. My wife turned to me, her face serious now. "We need to prepare for what's coming," she said. "And we need to make sure we're ready. This is just the beginning." I wanted to say something reassuring, but I couldn't find the words. The reality of the situation was setting in. The HOA wasn't just some petty group of neighbors. They were powerful, and now they had the law on their side. But my wife wasn't giving up. She wasn't going to let them crush us. She wasn't going to let them have the last word. We started making calls, getting our legal team involved. We gathered evidence, talked to other homeowners who had been bullied by the HOA, and started to prepare for the fight of our lives. We weren't going to let them destroy our home. We weren't going to let them win. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew. Every knock on the door, every letter in the mailbox, made my heart race. I was always on edge, always wondering when the next attack would come. And then, just when I thought we were ready for anything, another letter arrived. This one was different. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the city. I ripped open the envelope, my hands shaking, and read the letter. It was a notice of a hearing. The city was getting involved. The HOA had escalated things even further. I turned to my wife, my mind racing. "They're pulling in the city now. This is bigger than we thought." She looked at me, her face stone cold. "We knew this was coming," she said, her voice calm. "But we're ready. We've got the truth on our side." And I realized she was right. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. And now we had to fight. We had to take this all the way. The morning after we received that letter from the city, I felt a knot in my stomach. The reality of what we were up against was starting to sink in. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It wasn't just a bunch of neighbors playing petty power games. Now, the city was involved. This was a whole new level. I stood by the window, staring out at the quiet suburban streets, the same streets that only a few weeks ago had felt so peaceful. Now, they seemed like a battlefield. The HOA had turned everything upside down, and they weren't going to stop until they had crushed us. "Are you okay?" My wife's voice broke through my thoughts. She had been quiet all morning, her face unreadable as she paced around the house, making phone calls, sending emails, organizing everything we needed for the upcoming court battle. I looked at her, but I couldn't quite find the words to answer. "I don't know," I finally said. This is bigger than I thought. The city's involved now. It's not just a lawsuit anymore. This could ruin us." She stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing. "It's not going to ruin us. We're going to fight, and we're going to win." Her confidence was unwavering. I admired it. I needed it. But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. The HOA had allies. They had connections. They were in bed with people who had influence, who could make this whole thing disappear if they wanted to. And we were just a couple of homeowners trying to stand up for what was right. I grabbed the city's letter from the counter and read it again. A hearing was scheduled. It was the next step in the legal process, and the city would be evaluating the complaints made by the HOA. They were taking this seriously, and that terrified me. I had never been involved in anything like this before. I had no idea how to navigate the legal system, and I definitely didn't know how to fight a machine as powerful as the HOA. But my wife wasn't worried. "We're going to gather every bit of evidence we can," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to prove that they have no case, and we're going to turn this around." I knew she was right, but the thought of standing in front of a judge, fighting for our home, made my heart race. What if we lost? What if the HOA won? What if we couldn't afford the legal fees? What if we lost everything? I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. "We need to get organized. We need to be ready." "We will be," she said, her tone fierce now. "I've been through tougher situations than this. We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The next few days were a blur. We gathered every piece of evidence we could find. We took photos of the so-called violations the HOA had accused us of, and we began talking to other homeowners in the neighborhood. Some of them had experienced the same thing. Others were too scared to speak up, afraid of the HOA's wrath. But a few had stories to tell, and those stories were crucial. The more people who spoke out, the stronger our case would be. I spent hours researching the HOA's history. I dug into their past lawsuits, their complaints, their power plays. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep this ran. This wasn't just about a few rules. This was about control, about power, about using fear to dominate the entire neighborhood. And the more I learned, the more I understood how much was at stake. It wasn't just our house anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed around by the HOA, everyone who had been too scared to speak out. We had to fight, not just for ourselves, but for them too. But then came the moment that made everything click into place, the moment that changed everything. We were sitting in the living room preparing our arguments when my wife's phone buzzed. She picked it up, read the message, and her face went white. "What is it?" I asked, my heart sinking at the look on her face. She turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's from one of the neighbors. They have proof. The HOA. They've been falsifying records. They've been lying about the violations. All of them." I couldn't breathe. "What? How?" She handed me the phone, and I read the message. It was a series of photos and documents from a neighbor who had worked for the HOA years ago. The documents showed discrepancies in the HOA's records, altered dates, changed measurements, manipulated data. It was all right there, black and white. The realization hit me like a freight train. The HOA had been fabricating evidence. They hadn't just been nitpicking, they had been lying. They had been using their power to manipulate the entire neighborhood. My wife's eyes locked onto mine. "We've got them," she said, her voice steady but with a fire burning behind it. "We've got everything we need to expose them." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe we had a chance after all. Maybe, just maybe, we could take down the HOA and end this nightmare. But there was still one huge obstacle. We needed to be careful. If the HOA caught wind of what we had, they'd fight back with everything they had. We had to be smart. We had to play this right. "Are we really going to do this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "We're going to expose them. We're going to make sure they never have the power to hurt anyone again." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the HOA president's smug face, Linda's cold smile, and the officers at my door. The fight had been brewing for so long, and now, tomorrow, we were about to face the full wrath of everything they'd been plotting. My wife sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the evidence we had gathered. Her face was set, determined, but even I could see the exhaustion creeping into her eyes. This wasn't just a fight for our home anymore. This was a battle for everything we stood for: justice, integrity, and the right to live in peace without being bullied by the people in power. "We're ready," she said, her voice unwavering as she looked up from the papers. "We've got everything we need." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be even harder than we thought. The city was involved now. The HOA had money, lawyers, and years of influence. They weren't just going to let us expose their lies without a fight. And we weren't just fighting for our house anymore. We were fighting for every single person who had ever been intimidated by the HOA and too scared to speak up. But what if they came for us with everything they had? What if we lost? I shook my head, trying to focus. Tomorrow wasn't the time for doubt. It was the time for action. The courtroom was a stark, cold place, with a buzz of tension hanging in the air. As we walked in, I could feel the eyes on us. People who lived in the neighborhood, neighbors who had been silent for too long, were watching from the stands. They were waiting to see what would happen. Some of them had already made up their minds, knowing the HOA had power, while others hoped, just like us, that we would win. The room went quiet when Linda walked in. She was wearing her best business face, all smiles and authority, like she was the one in control. Behind her, the two board members and their lawyer took their seats, ready to do battle. But there was something different about Linda today. She didn't have the same smug confidence she had the last time we faced her. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. And for the first time, I felt like we might actually have a shot at winning this. The judge called the room to order, and the hearing began. Linda's lawyer started with the usual rhetoric, claims about our violations, how our home was a nuisance, how we were disrupting the peaceful order of the neighborhood. He presented documents, photos, and testimonies from other homeowners, all attempting to paint us as rule breakers and bad neighbors. It was exactly what I had expected. But then, it was our turn. My wife stood up first, walking to the podium with a confidence that I had never seen in her before. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't shaking. She was ready. She presented our case methodically. She showed the evidence, the discrepancies in the HOA's records, the falsified complaints, the photos and documents we had collected. With each piece of evidence she presented, I saw Linda's face fall further and further. The once smiling president of the HOA was now looking as though she had just seen a ghost. But it wasn't just the evidence that hit hard. It was the truth. The truth about how the HOA had been abusing their power, how they had manipulated the rules to get what they wanted. My wife didn't just speak from the documents, she spoke with passion. She spoke about how the HOA was hurting families, ruining lives, and causing unnecessary stress and anxiety. She didn't just fight for us. She fought for every person who had ever been afraid to stand up. And then came the bombshell, the piece of evidence that changed everything. We had a recording. A neighbor who had worked for the HOA years ago had secretly recorded conversations between Linda and other board members. In those conversations, Linda herself had admitted that they had been fabricating complaints, altering records, and using their power to bully homeowners into submission. The recording was clear. It was undeniable. When that audio played in the courtroom, the room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Linda's face turned pale, and she looked as though she had been slapped. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. She just sat there, stunned. Her lawyer tried to protest, to dismiss the recording as a fabrication, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The truth was out. The judge called for a recess, and as we waited, I could see the panic in the HOA's camp. They were scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage their reputation, how to save face. It was too late. They had been caught. When the judge returned, he didn't waste any time. He made his ruling. The HOA had overstepped its bounds. They had abused their power, and the court was not going to stand for it. The case was dismissed, and the HOA was ordered to pay damages to us for the emotional distress and harassment we had suffered. It felt like a dream, a surreal moment that I couldn't quite believe. We had won. We had actually won. But as we walked out of the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sadness. We had fought so hard to expose the truth, but it was only the beginning. The HOA wouldn't just disappear. They wouldn't stop their power trips. But today, we had proven that people like us could stand up to them, and that was a victory in itself.